Hello, and welcome back to the second episode of Reclaiming Resistance. I'm your host, Kat. For many migrant women who have survived trafficking, facing the UK justice system can feel like entering another form of punishment. Legal aid is limited, access to specialist support is inconsistent, and too often women are left to navigate complex legal processes alone, sometimes while still in detention or after being wrongly criminalised for offences they were forced to commit. Without legal advice, many plead guilty to crimes where they were actually the victim. They're told they have no chance, no options. In today's episode, I speak with Philippa Southwell, a criminal defence barrister who has spent over a decade fighting for justice on behalf of trafficking and modern slavery survivors. She explains how our legal system continues to fail the very people it claims to protect, and what needs to change to ensure survivors are seen, heard, and defended. Can you tell me a bit about yourself and about the work you do supporting victim survivors of trafficking and modern slavery?
So my name is Philippa Southwell. I'm a specialist human trafficking and modern slavery lawyer. I run a specialist law firm called Southwell and Partners, which specialises in representing victims of human trafficking and modern slavery in a forced criminality context. So I defend victims that have been compelled and forced to commit criminal offences. And I've represented most of the non-prosecution, non-punishment cases in the Court of Appeal of the last 15 years.
How did you come into this work and what inspired you to do it?
This work really began with one case which became the lead non-prosecution, non-punishment case. And then it really sort of spurred my interest. And I am a criminal defence practitioner. And what this lead case really sort of highlighted to me is the dichotomy between victim and perpetrator, and how we process individuals through the criminal justice system who are defendants but also victims at the same time. It is a very specialist area of law, and it sort of really spurred my interest in looking at what miscarriages of justice they had there been and what was currently going through the justice system. And I've represented several hundreds of victims of modern slavery that have been forced to commit offences.
Why do victim survivors of trafficking need to appeal criminal convictions? Why are they so often criminalised when they shouldn't be?
So the criminal case is a very important part of an individual's journey through the legal system. So those who have convictions may have deportation orders that are triggered as a result of the criminal convictions. And it's like a domino effect. So once they've entered into the criminal justice system and got a conviction, many things then affect that victim. So however old the conviction is, however minor the offence may be, it's very important that we seek to challenge the conviction. It also means that they may not be able to access certain types of compensation like miscarriage of justice or seeker compensation because they have outstanding convictions. Many will have fines, court fines that they need to pay as a result of the conviction, which many can't, and that will continue to follow them throughout their lives. There's also the mental rehabilitation of getting the conviction overturned. In certain cultures and communities, the conviction is seen as dirty, as a bad thing. And in terms of the offending being linked to their exploitation, it's very cathartic for the victim to finally have that clean record. And then obviously the direct impact of how that will then affect their applications for British citizenship, for example, their deportation challenges. It will directly impact and affect the subsequent or parallel proceedings in a positive way.
Can you elaborate on the issue of criminalisation of victim survivors of trafficking? Why is it that a victim survivor ends up being criminalised in the first place?
What we see domestically is many victims being exploited, trafficked to and within the UK in a number of different ways. It may not just be that they're trafficked for sexual exploitation or labour exploitation or forced criminality exploitation, but they may be trafficked for in a number of ways throughout their time in the UK. Victims are a commodity to traffickers, and it's a way of utilising and monetising that individual. So victims will be used, for example, to cultivate cannabis. They'll be put to work in a cannabis farm tending the plants. They may also be put to work running drugs throughout counties. I've seen a whole rainbow of types of criminality, from pickpocketing to road traffic offences, all the way up to attempted murder and terrorist cases. It really is a very diverse, the modus operandi is exactly the same for traffickers, but they're using, they're elaborating and changing the different types of ways that they exploit individuals. It can touch all types of offending.
Can you give us some examples of the typical facts of your cases?
So, for example, I see trends in terms of pockets of the UK. You can see how trafficking rings are operating and how they're exploiting individuals in certain types of forced criminality. The very common types that we see in the UK are Vietnamese individuals trafficked for forced cannabis production. We're seeing a huge amount of British national young people and vulnerable adults being trafficked in county lines drug running and running of weapons. We're seeing a lot of individuals trafficked for forced labour exploitation, but then go on to commit things like targeted metal thefts from building sites, targeted pickpocketing, targeted thefts from stores. We also see victims involved in certain types of sexual exploitation and trafficking themselves. These cases are complex, so somebody may graduate up the triangle of the organisation whilst still being exploited themselves, and those are very complicated cases in terms of nexus of offending and criminality, but it does touch upon all types of exploitation and forced criminality. What we tend to see is victims being trafficked for sexual exploitation, but then will go on to commit things such as benefit frauds, money laundering offences. They may be in the UK for some time working for their exploiter, and they're commoditised in different ways. So they may become very traumatised in the sexual exploitation setting and then are utilised in another way, whether that's through a benefit fraud. I've had many victims work, for example, in legitimate jobs, but the salary will go into the trafficker's account or an account that the trafficker has access to. So it's quite common that we will see certain types of benefit fraud, document offences for that type of victim.
What are the challenges in representing victim survivors of trafficking in these cases?
There's always this friction between victim and defendant, and once somebody is being interviewed as a suspect and then charged, it's how do we navigate that person who's vulnerable through the criminal justice system. There are certain safeguarding things in place. We can apply, for example, for a defence intermediary. We can apply to have the proceedings severed if they are jointly charged with somebody involved in their exploitation, which is common. We can also apply to have the proceedings moved to a different court, because usually you are prosecuted in a 10 court in the place that the offence is committed. So lots of times we're having victims having to travel back into a danger area to attend their court hearing. So these are some of the practical issues that we see when representing victims who are defendants and being processed through the criminal justice system. There's also the difficulty of identifying, getting disclosures. Victims also routinely will not want to make disclosures and only answer what they're being asked. Is about looking at more probing questions, particularly when we analyse cases that have gone wrong where victims have not been identified in the first instance criminal case, and we're looking at it through an appeal lens. We're routinely seeing indicators missed. They may be not saying I'm trafficked, but they're using similar language that, they may have a Section 45 modern slavery defence, which is being missed by defence practitioners, police station representatives, courts. So we're routinely seeing a Section 45 slavery defence being put forward in a mitigation when it's a guilty plea. So we're still missing it. It's lack of training for law enforcement, from, defence practitioners, from CPS. And these are very sort of difficult, nuanced cases that we need to be alive to asking the right questions.
At what stage in the victim survivor's journey do you start working with them, especially in regards to supporting them in criminal appeals? Do people make referrals to you?
So I get referrals from all over the country, and actually from other countries as well when they're being removed. It's usually post-conviction, sometimes post-serving of their sentence. It takes a long time to prepare an appeal, on average about a year. Certain types of appeals take more time. So a lot of the time the victim has served their sentence or are in immigration detention, so they've been transferred. They've been picked up by immigration or Home Office or support workers or charities that go into prisons or in an immigration detention. So it's usually towards the end of their sentence or once they've been transferred to immigration detention. They may have been released and are back in the community and have only just felt able to make disclosures, which is actually quite common for certain types of victims. It might be that many years on, they feel in a position to be able to make those disclosures, and it might be the first time that they've made a disclosure. So it's a long time after the conviction.
What do you think needs to be done to make it easier for victim survivors of trafficking facing criminalisation to get help either before they are convicted or after?
I think there needs to be a look into the legal aid system, because a lot of it's not funded or very poorly funded, and what that leads to is miscarriages of justice. So, for example, there is no funding available, legal aid funding available to make pre-disposal representations, pre-charge. So if somebody's been interviewed as a suspect before it's gone to CPS for a decision on whether to charge that person, cases involving victims of forced criminality or who may be running Section 45 defence pre-charge, there is no funding available for us to make representations or to assist that person outside of just that police interview. And that's a really important stage, because once they've been charged and enter into the criminal justice system, they're then in that. And then it takes a very long time. They have to go through trial. They may be on remand. So there's lack of funding. We're seeing mistakes with speedy justice, advocates processing cases through the Magistrates Court, this pressure to enter a plea early. So there needs to be more specialist training. There needs to be more support for victims from grassroots organisations. So, having the specialist advocate that can assist them with, making sure that they're at court, come to the solicitor's office. Many victims will have multiple ongoing proceedings at the same time. It might be a public law case, civil case, judicial review, immigration and criminal. And it's a lot to handle. And it's making sure that the victim has somebody that can sort of help them navigate that period in their life where this is all ongoing. In terms of the NRM and victim identification, I think there is a huge problem with the delay in decision making, and I think that needs to be addressed. Lots of victims are waiting a very, very long time for their determinations, and their lives are on hold while that decision is pending.
I imagine a lot of the people you represent are migrants. I'm wondering, what are the particular challenges people from other communities might face in accessing support when they're facing criminalisation?
Well, actually, the stats show a slightly different demographic. Obviously, one of the highest nationalities is British nationals that have been exploited, and that's mainly to do with the issues of drug running, weapon running between counties. So we do have a large portion of British nationals, of particularly vulnerable individuals. We have a huge demographic of Vietnamese nationals who have been trafficked. Albanian, Nigerian, Chinese are the highest that we see. In terms of getting support, particularly for those young people or unaccompanied minors, those are the problems that we have, where individuals are, for example, placed in foster care or placed in not appropriate housing or don't have the appropriate support. One of the gap areas that we see is, individuals that once they've turned 18, the 18 to sort of 25-year-olds are still extremely vulnerable, and a lot of the help and support drops off at that stage. So that's one of the problems that we see in terms of that age bracket of particularly foreign nationals in the UK that have been exploited.
What impact does criminalisation have on victim survivors of trafficking?
I think one of the issues is that, a lot of these cases involve quite serious offending, which attaches custodial sentences, and it's the impact of being detained, incarcerated, that experience of being detained in a prison and then potentially an immigration detention centre. It's quite traumatising for an individual, particularly those who are foreign nationals who don't speak the language. It's very alienating for them, and that time period that they've been incarcerated can be months or sometimes years, when they should be rehabilitating.
Do you think that there is adequate support for victim survivors in prisons?
In terms of support within prisons, there is, there are NGOs that operate within prisons, and there are foreign national coordinators. There does need to be, I think, an increase in terms of awareness in identifying victims who are serving prisoners, who may be potentially victims of exploitation. Again, that we need training in relation to how to identify those individuals. A place of detention is not really a suitable place for a victim to rehabilitate, and any type of victim to rehabilitate. So whilst there is access to healthcare and therapy through the healthcare service within the detention centres and prisons, it's not a desirable place for somebody to recover from their experience.
What are other problems for victim survivors that you've observed in terms of policy and legislation?
I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to get NRMs quickly made within the guidance timeframes. I think one of the biggest issues is the delays in making the decisions, because it holds up not only the criminal case but other parts of their, immigration, etc. And so really there does need to be, I think, further funding in terms of staffing and resources for the NRM so that decisions can be made within an acceptable time frame.
What do you think needs to change?
I think there needs to be more training for frontline professionals, whether that be law enforcement, medical staff, local authorities, probation, judges, defence lawyers, those individuals that are likely to come in contact with people that are being exploited in a forced criminality setting. And there needs to be specialist training about the control mechanisms, which are sometimes invisible. And it's, how do we deal with that in the criminal justice context, where we usually deal with tangible evidence. So it's looking at specialist training for those frontline professionals, so that individuals are not being missed that may be involved in forced criminality exploitation.
What would you like listeners to know about victim survivors of trafficking in the UK?
So in terms of victims of exploitation, particularly in relation to forced criminality exploitation, these are very difficult cases, because particularly where an individual may also go on to be involved in an organised criminal network whilst being exploited themselves, there's a victim at the other end of that too. And it's sort of identifying what the sort of issues are in terms of how the trafficking gangs and perpetrators are using individuals as commodities, more awareness raising for public. So you're looking at the types of places that victims may be exploited. It might be through forced labour, and nail bars, and other types of also legitimate work that may be quite public facing, but who are still in a position of exploitation. So again, it's public awareness. It should be easy reporting for the public and there are many charities and NGOs and ways to report concerns for victims who you think might be in a position of exploitation.